painted a world beyond imagination, unseen to the modern eye, not capable of being grasped by mere mortal thought. A world where one can decide the fate of civilization by learning from history. A world we call reality.
Imagine, dear viewer, for the sake of argument, you're transported to the fall of 1938, Europe.
Chamberlain has just returned from Munich with an agreement with that funny little German fellow. On the cusp of war, Chamberlain has managed to secure peace for our time. This strategy would later be labeled as appeasement, as less than a year later, war would fall on the European continent with Germany's invasion of Poland. But you already know this. You learn from history. Here you are now, 1938, less than a year to better the world and maybe change history. A year from now, Germany will invade Poland. A year from now, World War II will begin, and appeasement will have failed. Do you learn from your history? How might you stop that awful reality from happening? Is Poland doomed to fall with the rest of Europe, or could you change the scale by giving the Polish people a fighting chance, arming them, readying them for an increase in hostility? You recall in 1944 when there was the uprising in Warsaw. You know how the Polish people can fight. Alas, in this strange world we call reality, you cannot change the past. Merely learn from it. Instead, I ask you, dear viewer, consider the following. You are no longer in the past, at least not the distant one. It is year of our Lord 2022. War has once again come to the European continent. A war set upon after the governments that be failed to appease the dictator's quench for power. You've seen how history went the last time this occurred. The dictator cannot be appeased. He's made the same arguments as the last one. These people belong to our country. They must be returned home, reunited. We will restore the old empire, make it great. This time you are not merely a passive observer, you are a somewhat senile leader of the free world. Now you have the power to stop the war from escalating. Make no mistake, it will escalate. The dictator has already said as much. So what will you do now, having learned from your history? Will you take the path of appeasement, of non-intervention, of a failed isolationist policy? Or will you do something that might actually make a difference?
I want to talk with you about a number of subjects that directly affect the future of the United States.
In case you somehow missed it, in the last presidential election, the topic of Ukraine came up a whole lot of times. Donald Trump claimed repeatedly that he was the president for peace after all, and as we can see recently, he seems to be succeeding in that regard. Not really, but we gotta give him credit for trying. During the height of the war during the Biden administration, you saw a lot of right-wing influencers attempt to spin the narrative to make it more of Ukraine's fault, and there was a lot of reasons for that.
Ukraine is the enemy of this country. Ukraine is our enemy.
Now, the fellow you just heard from, as I'm sure many of you are already aware, is a guy named Tim Pool. Tim Pool has defended the Trump administration every chance he gets. Tim Pool does not acknowledge any criticism to his ideology nor his talking points. At the time he made those statements in the video you see above, Tim Pool was getting hundreds of thousands of dollars for every single one of his talk shows that he puts on YouTube. Hundreds of thousands of dollars from the Russian government. Now, despite the fact that Tim Pool is god-awful at verifying where his money is coming from and received several direct notes that said, hey, you need to treat Russia better in your videos, Tim Pool now works in the White House press pool for some godforsaken reason. Now, fellow number two that you've seen flash before your pretty little eyes is a guy named Benny Johnson. Benny Johnson also received several $100,000 for videos he put out criticizing the war in Ukraine. Benny Johnson is seen here on a Turning Point USA video, again providing misinformation to the American people. Now, to be fair and balanced to Tim Pool and Benny Johnson and those other MAGA influencers, they did claim to be victims and unknowing in that Russian influence scheme, but it does beg the question, why was Russia giving them hundreds of thousands of dollars to spread these propagandic lies in the first place? Oh, hey, Benny, that's perfect timing of you. I need to use this as a little bit of an example now. I haven't had a chance to research the entirety of Benny's video here, but it comes from a larger, longer video about how supposedly Ukraine is a state sponsor of terrorism. As evidence to support his claim, he flashes on the screen real quick with their slick little editing how Ukraine having cluster munitions are supposedly equating it to terrorism. In case you don't know, cluster munitions are quite controversial. Cluster munitions are, essentially for the uninitiated, a big bomb made out of little bombs. It is controversial because a lot of those little bombs don't always blow up when they are intended to, and they can litter a field or possibly even a cityscape that is intended to be lived on by citizens later on after a war. They can create casualties well after the war's end, like many other unexploded ordnances if you've ever been in Europe any time after World War I or II. You'd understand. Now, what Benny doesn't do is explain the context around the cluster munitions or why Ukraine adopted them, which is namely because of their effectiveness and the fact that Russia was continuously using these cluster munitions ever since their 2022 invasion. Now, does Benny go and claim that Russia is in fact a state-sponsored terrorist? I haven't seen any comments of the sort. Perhaps he has, and I'm simply being an ignorant liberal, so if you could go down to comments, provide me an example of Benny showing that Russia is in fact a state sponsor of terrorism, I'd greatly appreciate it. Benny doesn't do that. Instead, he paints a narrative, and he doesn't explain the nuance or context of that narrative because, well, you can't get the entire history of a country in a 10-minute video. And yes, as I said, the conflict in Ukraine does bear much resemblance to the start of World War II and Nazis' invasion of the rest of Europe. But Benny doesn't get paid to provide you context. Benny doesn't get paid to tell you the truth. Benny gets paid to make a divisive narrative. They all do. And that's the unfortunate reality of this modern-day media ecosystem. And you will have the unsuspecting youngin' voter go out about themselves and say, wow, I can't believe Ukraine is doing that, providing cluster munitions without the full context of what they are or even why Ukraine might do that. Because Benny did a disservice in his media ecosystem, and their media died. And that is the unfortunate reality we're dealing with. But you, dear viewer, are not victim to Benny's here shenanigans. You are, in fact, a viewer of the Fireside Chats, and we're going to do a little better around here. So yes, we here on the Fireside Chats do in fact support NATO and the support in Ukraine in their fight against Russia. They are the victim of Russian imperialism. They are the victim of Russian fraud. They are the victim of Russian drug smuggling and every other thing that you can possibly think of, to include cultural and actual genocide. Russia has continuously threatened its westward expansion into European countries and NATO members. Those countries only desire to join NATO because of the Soviet Union's actions during the Cold War and the oppression they received. I know that. I've seen it personally. Russia's narrative exists in the same state of flux that the Nazi narrative did prior to World War II. Let us take over the Sudetenland. That's all we need. We just want to reunite the Germans. Russia, in much the same way Putin has said that the Ukrainian people are a myth. They do not exist. He has written an entire essay about how Ukrainian culture is, in fact, Russian culture, and that they must be one people. Ukrainian language, despite the fact its many differences, very much comparable to the languages of Western Europe, in relation to their differences, it was heavily eradicated during the time of the Soviet Union. The WWII, which you've probably heard of different Republican or conservative commentators make statements about how the American populace didn't know anything about until this war in Ukraine.
Remember the Holodomor? Do you even know what it was?
Was in fact very much on the Ukrainians' minds when they voted for independence back in the 90s from the Soviet Union. All of these are facts that should be reported upon more, but you were done a disservice. Indeed, that is the job of these commentators on the internet. They are not here to provide you the unabashed truth of the other side's narrative. They are here to obfuscate. They are here to lie, to muddy the waters a little bit, if you will. We can talk about the nuances of the Ukrainian conflict, but it makes it a little difficult when they're pushing out information and not providing the full context of it. Imagine, if you will, again, I travel back in time to the earliest 20th century, and all somebody wants to do is explain to you is how, hey, all that Hitler guy wanted to do was, help bring civilization to some of Europe. All he wants to do is reunite lands taken to him after World War I. I mean, there could be some argument to be made about the failures of the Versailles Treaty, but does that excuse the crimes, the war, the atrocities? Absolutely not. Does that make his argument any more valid? No. It's the fact that these things are not presented in context, and you are being lied to continuously, and they want you to be lied to. That's the reason they never engage in a good faith discussion. That's the reason they will stand there and make hypocritical statements one day. Benny Johnson is not in favor of U.S. intervention in foreign countries, but we should go ahead and just invade Canada. That'll be real easy.
You're going to invade Venezuela, which I'm totally against. Invade Canada, I'm more in favor of that, frankly. But what are you going to do with that? Invade by peaceful means. I think Canada, you could just kick in the front door, honestly, and they just surrender. I think you could do that. I honestly think that would roll.
1941, a somewhat famous German dictator told his generals, who grew increasingly nervous about the upcoming Operation Barbarossa and the invasion of the Soviet Union, we only have to kick the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. Patrick Beck-David, whose video I'm going to criticize heavily here soon and am shamelessly stealing clips from, as you see above, gave much of his discussion regarding the Ukraine conflict And then he stated that much of it can be boiled down to how the military-industrial complex is desperate to have an enemy, a perceived enemy in Russia, so that way they can constantly make money. But as Donald Trump has continuously increased the number of U.S. enemies that we must somehow militarily take over, which, as we know, would cause an increase in the military-industrial complex and their profits to good chance soar. What does good old PBD discuss instead?
Of the visionary, the president who is up there, he's speaking a different language than the previous presidents. We're not used to this. People are not used to, in our lifetime, we've not had a president thinking about things like this. It's all like, yeah, Gorbachev, bring down that wall. Big deal, respect. Reagan, economy, the progressive taxes, Bill Clinton, the budget, balancing the budget with Newt Gingrich, Obamacare, oh my God, health care for all, and then it's not going to cost you a single penny in taxes, 27% we were, I'm like, what the hell is going on here? Bush, 9/11, war, all this stuff, senior. No, Trump is saying, let's expand. What do you mean, let's expand? Canada, come on. Panama Canal, yes. Venezuela, 30 to 50 million barrels. Greenland, Cuba, why Cuba? Why are they 90 miles away from us? No, Cuba. Really, Cuba? Yes, Cuba. And what about Colombia? Well, he's throwing Colombia, petrol. We're talking about petrol. Honduras, all of these things that we're looking at.
We are in the twilight zone, ladies and gentlemen. The conservative media apparatus and the media apparatus at large will constantly make an excuse for the powers that be because their goal is not to actually engage in nuanced discussion. Their goal is entirely to make the narrative grayer. It is the Russian propaganda machine at work, as I have said numerous times before. But you, dear viewer, have seen through this twilight zone, and I encourage you to go and share the information amongst your friends and family. They want to control an information space. They want to put out as much untruths as they can, so that way it can spread around the world in about 20 seconds before the actual facts get a chance to catch their breath. Appeasement did not work in 1938. Appeasement would not work in 2022 during the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It's the reason that Republicans and Democrats agreed upon the solution. It's the reason that the right-wing commentators couldn't possibly give that nuance. It's the reason they had to blame it all upon one senile old man. So pay attention to that information space. And as always, watch this space.